of life.
Welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report, our region's longest-running public affairs program. Lawmakers from northeastern Minnesota are joining us today for a recap of the week's activities at the state capitol. This is your opportunity to call or email your legislative questions and have them answered live on the air. Minnesota Legislative Report starts now.
Hello, welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, WDSE News and Public Affairs producer Greg Grell. Well, when lawmakers return to the Capitol to work on Monday, they will have just 28 days until the constitutional deadline for the legislature to adjourn. Expect House and Senate floor sessions nearly every day next week and the probable start of conference committees in the near future. Plenty to talk about with lawmakers that represent you, so call in your questions right now. Locally, you can dial 218-788-2844. If you're calling from outside the local area, dial our toll-free number, which is 1-877-307-8762. You can also email your questions to askmlr@wdse.org. Now it's time to introduce the legislators who are joining us here in the studio. We'll start with Representative Mary Murphy, a Democrat from Hermantown. Rep, welcome back.
Thank you, Greg.
Senator Erik Simonson, Democrat from Duluth. Welcome back.
Thanks, Greg.
Representative Mike Sundin is here. He's a Democrat from Esko. Welcome, Representative Sundin.
It's great to be here.
And Representative Rob Ecklund, also a Democrat from International Falls. And it's nice to see you all here on such a beautiful day. And boy, what a difference a week makes. Last week, as you may know, we had to cancel the show because of a blizzard. Today, we're enjoying finally a spring-like day. So I'm happy you're all here today. And we'll get started with Representative Ecklund. As I said in the intro, there's just about a month left in the session. From your point of view, obviously there's a lot of work left. Where do you think we're at as far as getting some of the major things accomplished that need to get done in the next 28 days?
Well, last week, Greg, first off, thanks for having me here. And last week was the third committee deadline, so all the bills for all the committees were rolled out. I think some finally got done on Friday. So we've got floor session scheduled for every day this week. We'll be voting on those bills, as I assume will the Senate, and then the conference committees will be named, because I'm sure there's quite a bit of difference between the two bodies' pieces of work that they put together.
Now, you're an assistant minority leader in the House. What role do you play in the conference committee procedure? Will you help select conferees, or is that up to the committee chairs? How does that work?
That's pretty much up to the Speaker of the House and his leadership team. We don't have much say in who's on the conference committees. But if you don't vote yes on a bill, you're not going to be on the conference committee. Mm-hmm. So.
And Senator Simonson, what about on the Senate side with a month left to go? What's your kind of perception of where you're at with what needs to be accomplished yet?
There's a lot of work to do in just 4 weeks. Every one of the bills that we've taken up on the Senate floor so far has been non-controversial. We still have a number of omnibus bills that are sitting in the committee somewhere, and there just doesn't seem to be a sense of urgency, which is a little bit concerning, but nonetheless, there's still ways to get things done, but we'll see what happens. I know Monday's floor session is scheduled with another group of non-controversial bills, so we'll see what happens here. Hopefully by the end of this week, things will be moving.
Mm-hmm. Well, Representative Sundin, you serve on the Transportation Finance Committee. Are there any bills of note that you'd like viewers and voters to know about?
No, there's no bills that are particular bills that are of concern right now, but there's a movement afoot to get a constitutional amendment to dedicate sales tax revenues from car parts and leases, that type of thing, into the trunk highway fund, and I certainly not in agreement with that at all. When you take those funds away from the general fund, you leave a hole, and that means somebody else suffers. So I'm more in favor of a gas tax than an increase in the gas tax than going that route.
All right. And Representative Murphy, what's the latest right now on K-12 education funding? Is there a funding measure? I know the governor has been asking for some additional funding. What's happening right now?
Well, the bill passed out of committee and is on the way to Ways and Means, and it's substantially different than the governor's in that it doesn't spend as much money, and it at first did not have anything at all to address cross subsidies for special education resources. And it was amended in committee to add $20 million. And she took the amendment. And so we didn't know if she would or not, but she did. And so that would be especially helpful to 709, District 709. Whether that stays in Ways and Means, I'm not sure, because it does go beyond what she had to spend.
Okay. Now, Representative Ecklund mentioned earlier that when the conference committees get put together, Representative Murphy, there's a lot of difference between what the governor wants and what particularly the Republicans in the House and Senate want. What do you think when this all comes to fruition? Is there going to be a big fight? Are we going to get everything done in time? is there potential for a special session?
We
this
have
year?
28 days, Greg. That's 4 weeks. That's a long time. We can do it.
All right, well, that's pretty definitive. Representative Ecklund, one of the issues this session has been the tax bill and getting the conformity with the federal tax bill, and there's been a lot of give and take over that. What is happening with any changes in the tax situation for Minnesotans this year?
Well, Greg, I don't sit on the tax committee, but I do know that Representative Marquardt and Representative Davids, the tax chair, are working well together on that. We're certainly hopeful that we'll get a tax bill that'll bring us towards federal tax conformity. I got that message from my accountant about a month ago when I had my taxes done. He said, you guys better get that done or it's going to be a nightmare next year. Sure. He said the federal taxes will be easy, the state taxes will be a nightmare if it's not done. So I think we need to get it done. Some of the reports that we've gotten from Representative Marquardt has showed that we're moving in that direction, and I think that the chair and our lead work well together, so we'll see if it happens.
All right. And Representative Sundin, you're on the Transportation Committee, correct?
Yes.
And transportation, one of the things that we're interested in here in northern Minnesota is the Northern Lights Express. It sounds like all systems are go now. They're just looking for funding for that. Is there anything you can talk about? Is there any bill or anything on that this session?
No, my understanding is the environmental impact statement or research is complete and ready to go there. As far as funding that, I don't see that happening anytime soon. That's not a priority of the majority party right now. And to make it economically feasible, I think you'd probably be looking at something close to a $5 gallon gas prices before people really start getting serious about that line.
Okay. And Senator Simonson, you sit on the Jobs and Economic Growth and Finance Policy Committee. Are there any bills out there right now that might improve the state's business climate, or bills that you want to talk about that have been going through that committee process?
We actually passed out our omnibus bill last week on a really bipartisan vote. It's really non-controversial. It's just mainly a couple of small policy items. It's a $15 million investment in broadband border-to-border program without any policy changes, and we actually put together a fairly reasonable bill given the very small target that they had to spend. That's also where our Duluth bill for the Essentia project is going. Next week we have a hearing on that in front of that committee. So there's some things moving, but not a lot of controversial items.
Representative Sundin?
In the House, the jobs bill, we had a similar measure, the $15 million mark for broadband, and we also included $750,000 for grants for satellite connections. So if a person needed to connect, let's say you're in a remote area where it's unserved, right. You could connect, and if this comes to fruition, individuals can apply for those grants to help offset the cost of hooking up to a satellite system.
Representative Ecklund, you represent an area that's largely rural. Do you feel like the state is doing enough to help folks to get that broadband? The quick internet, fast internet is so important these days to do business. What's your point of view on that?
Short answer is no. Yeah. I like to see that the $15 million is in there. I was on the bill. The original bill for that was $51 million that we were asking for, and it just wasn't in the targets that were set by the leadership. And You know, I use the example at my house. My wife and I both can't have a laptop going at the same time because then we both can't get on the internet. So that's how underserved we are. And yet I have 3 different fiber servers that go through my yard, and I can only access one of them. So and they go through for their redundancy, but they don't hook up to the people that are going through the yard. And they're not actually going through the yard; it's going through the right of way. But I do mow it. So,
Senator Simonson, is it a little bit of a difficult sell for the more Greater Minnesota lawmakers to try to explain to the Metro lawmakers that this is really a big issue in Greater Minnesota? Obviously, the Twin Cities has plenty of competition, lots of options when it comes to high-speed internet. Not so for many Minnesotans.
It's always a challenge for Greater Minnesota to try to educate Metro folks about what's different between what they have versus what we have necessarily. But this issue, even if you just go back 5 or 6 years, it was far fewer people that had any idea of what was happening in Greater Minnesota. So the conversation has shifted, and at this point, I think at least everybody has an awareness that the service that they enjoy in Minneapolis and St. Paul and the suburbs, and frankly here in Duluth, is not the same service that Representative Ecklund has, or that even Representative Murphy has access to. Just a few miles out of town has terrible service access. So I think the conversation has shifted over the last 5 or 6 years, and that's why you're continuing to see investments, albeit small. You're still seeing at least an investment in the program.
And Representative Ecklund?
Thank you. We did a rollout of the rural broadband initiative that we had last week, and an example of that is, we think that the Twin Cities always has great internet, but the lady in Rosemont didn't have good internet. When she moved from one house to another house 2 miles away, she found out that her internet access wasn't nearly as good. And so, talking to her afterwards, sounds like she has about what I do, and she doesn't live too far from, high population area. So it's an issue all across the state, and it's a conversation we're having between unserved and underserved, and it's a tough issue. I would like to see it go to like the rural electric cooperative network did when we made sure that we had electricity years ago for the rural areas. I think that's the next move that we got to make to make internet work and broadband work.
Representative Murphy, that did happen in Lake County, didn't it? Where they had broadband put in. I think they got some
Correct.
large grants to do that.
And the county paid a substantial amount of money also, and that came out of property tax money. But it's still not perfect. And the areas that surround Lake County still don't have the same kind of service. And so it's a problem everywhere, and the different counties deal with it in different ways, and the different companies that provide internet service certainly deal with it in their own unique fashions.
Representative Sundin?
Well, thank you. We've been told that the true investment needed is about $100 million per year for the next 10 years to satisfy the growing needs in Greater Minnesota, but we're falling short of that all the time. And the further out you go, the more expensive it is to serve a household. So your dollars don't go as far.
Is that the last mile?
The last mile story,
Right,
Yep.
right. Well, it happened with the electrification, the co-ops. Maybe that's what's going to have to happen again, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. We got a call from Jim in Orr, and before I ask that question, I want to remind you, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. This is your opportunity to call and get your questions answered here by our lawmakers in the studio here this afternoon. Jim is wondering about a bill that enables cities and townships to add sales tax for any project. What is the status of that bill? Now, I know we don't have a tax committee member here. Did you know what that's about, Representative Sundin?
I'll speak to that. Taxing authority is granted by the state of Minnesota to municipalities. And municipalities vote on it, and the typical measure is about 0.5% sales tax, and that's what we've got in Cloquet, and it's funding local projects quite well, and you have to have the consent of the legislature as well.
And Jim was also wondering about a bill or amendment number, and I know that's a tough one, so I don't think we'll be able to answer that because there's so many bills that go through unless you knew off the top of your head. You'll have to call the House Information. to find it out.
Can I speak to that?
Sure.
I rose on the House floor, I guess it was about 10 days ago, and I made comments about the amount of bills that were being drafted and submitted. And Representative Ecklund actually gave an award to the person that had the most bills, Representative Zerwas. And that was 117 at the time.
For this session?
And it's growing, yes.
Just
it's
for this
growing.
session, okay.
So we actually set a new record for volume of bills. It's over 4,404, I believe, today. So.
For the biennium.
For the biennium,
For the
yes.
2-year biennium. Representative Ecklund?
And being as I come from a paper mill town, I thank them for their wise use of paper. So.
Well, that is also, so folks know, don't call in just asking about House or Senate file number, because there's just too many of them for people to know all the numbers. Representative Ecklund, one issue that's been getting some attention this session is the wild rice bill, the sulfate standards. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, the sulfate standard, 10 milligram per liter, was put on with the Clean Water Act in 1973, and it's been unenforceable for municipalities and or our industries. It's a tough standard to meet, and I'll tell you how it's a tough standard to meet. That 10 milligrams per liter is their discharges from their systems. Well, the drinking water standard for sulfate is 250 milligrams per liter. So we can drink water that's got sulfate in it up to that amount, but yet they have to discharge it at 10 milligrams per liter. So that's some pretty serious treatment that needs to be done. And my second year at the legislature, I'll go back. 2015, the legislature directed the MPCA to come up with a new standard. And it was taking quite a bit of time for them to do it because the science was working and they're doing their process, but it was taking quite a bit of time. So last year, we offered an amendment to give them till 2019 to get it done. And the MPCA elected to go through and start their rulemaking this year anyway, and they had several public hearings across the state and took testimony, and when it was all said and done, the administrative law judge ruled their ruling as unenforceable and told them basically to go back to the drawing board. And so they tweaked their system a little bit, what they did, and resubmitted it to the chief administrative law judge. And just, I believe it was April 12th, but about the middle of April, the chief administrative law judge basically ruled the same thing and said, this is unenforceable. You need to come up with a better standard. So that's what we're trying to do. We need to come up with a standard that'll work for everybody. But one of the estimates of the costs, if this standard would have gone through as the MPCA proposed, it would have cost WLSSD $500 million to upgrade their plan. Well, that's a lot of increase to the ratepayers, whether it's industry or the households. And so it needs to be. We need to address it. We need to come up with the right. And I'm not for throwing the standard out. I want wild rice as much as anybody, but we need to get a standard that'll work for everybody. And in the meantime, knowing that this is probably going to end up in court, we were able to get some money into the LCCMR bill to study wild rice and some of the other effects that we're having on wild rice, like invasives and water levels and stuff like that. So there's provision in the LCCMR bill right now that the Minnesota Chippewa tribes can go through the DNR for competitive grants to study the effects of wild rice. So I think we can do both things at the same time.
And Senator Simonson.
So we heard this bill in committee too, and I think it's important for folks to realize that I don't think there's any lawmaker in northeastern Minnesota that doesn't support the wild rice, right? And how important that is to certain populations. We understand that, but I think this issue has evolved into something that we really need to address. And sometimes, I voted for this bill when it came through committee because, frankly, I'm frustrated that the PCA hasn't taken the actions to try to figure out what's going to work for our municipalities, for our wastewater treatment systems, for our industries, for our tribes, for our clean drinking water. And I think sometimes you've got to stand up and take a hard vote on something just to make the point to the governor's office that, look, we've got a problem here that we need to solve. So I'm actually meeting with the governor's staff tomorrow, and the whole point is going to be to try to say, this is an opportunity that we bring all of these interested parties into the room and come around the table and try to figure out a workable solution, because right now there is so much confusion all across northern Minnesota that nobody knows what to do, and quite frankly, nobody knows what to plan for. So we've got to come to a place where we can craft a solution. Lawmakers should not be setting the standard. This should be based on science. And the last thing we want is for an administrative law judge somewhere down the line to be making up what the standard is for Minnesota.
And Representative Ecklund, part of a democracy is a give and take, right? And to come up with, a common sense solution. Now, $500 million in upgrades just for one plant doesn't sound like that is going to be sustainable. Do you feel like there is a common ground that can be found in the long run that will both protect wild rice and, keep these costs down?
I think so, because there's a lot of entities that are looking at this. Representative Metz and I met with the tribes in December to talk about this issue, and they felt snubbed by the MPCA. And they have research. Fond du Lac's got researchers working on this all the time. The Leech Lake Band has researchers working on it. Leech Lake Band, wild rice is a very lucrative business for them, and so they want it to keep functioning and work for them. And so they felt snubbed by the PCA, and we took that message back. And so what I would like to see a work group work with the tribes and industry and the PCA. And I think if you put the three of them together, maybe we can come up with a solution that'll work.
Representative Sundin.
Thank you. I did meet with one of our tribal leaders from the Cloquet area, and he's all on board for those conversations. The science is the same. The science is on the table. The people have to rally around that, the information that we do have, and come up with a solution.
Does it make sense to have a lake-by-lake standard rather than just a blanket standard? Because we do know that there are different levels that can be, at least according to the research I've looked at, that different lakes can handle different amounts of sulfates and so on. Or does that make it too complex?
That may be workable to some point, but all of a sudden you're having. I think it makes it too complex in the long run. I think we need to try to come up with one standard that can work across the state. And if you think about it, the Native American bands, they say that there's 2,300 lakes or something like that, water bodies in the state of Minnesota that are wild rice. Well, that's from here south of the cities, maybe even to the Iowa border. And if you start trying to do lake by lake, our MPCA is going to be a pretty big operation. There's going to be a lot of people working there. So.
Right. All right, well, thanks for your thoughtful comments on that, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more about this as it moves along over the coming months and years. We have a call from John in Renshaw, and I'll start with Representative Murphy, but everybody might want to chime in on this one. And John is wondering, what's the legislature doing to answer calls for stronger gun control? Representative Murphy?
Not much. They're not. They had a hearing in the House of Representatives, and there are rallies almost every week by some group or another group, both in favor of greater controls for guns and those that are opposed to any changes in the gun laws or the safety laws. We are spending $25 million on safe school legislation. That's in addition to what's already being spent, and the levies for the safer schools and changes in school policies that have to do with the children's having a safe place to learn. There was discussion in those committees about whether we should do that or not, but no amendment proceeded. The majority party in both the House and the Senate, as I see it, do not want to see any changes or any conversations about gun control in the major bills. And so I don't think I expect that on some bills, the public safety bill or the omnibus public safety bill and maybe the bill that has to do with civil law, when those are on discussion on the floor of the House of Representatives, I expect that there may be amendments that come forth. But I also expect that the majority, if the majority wants to hear an amendment, they will propose an amendment. And if they don't want to hear an amendment, it will be ruled out of order.
Representative Sundin, there's been an awful lot of pressure out there for something to happen. Is it surprising to you that nothing is moving?
No, not given the majority party as it sits. But on that point, or on this topic, I believe it was on Wednesday of last week, I had a visitor in my office, and I think he stopped by and saw Representative Ecklund afterward. And he's a lobbyist for the National Rifle Association, and he wanted to touch base with me and take the temperature of the legislature, I guess. And I had a very, very frank discussion with him, and I pointed out to him that if they don't get on board with some kind of solution for gun crime and gun violence, they're not going to like what happens down the line. Now, I'm speaking as a former NRA member, and I used to appreciate their efforts, but what it's morphed into now is just protecting what they think is a Second Amendment, their extreme interpretation of the Second Amendment, and they're obstructing some real progress for school safety, for public safety, and I just let them know that if they don't get on board and start being part of the solution, what's happening here with the upheaval of emotion around this issue, they're probably not going to like the solutions that might be coming down the track at them.
So what you're saying is if they work constructively, they may get something that's a little bit more amenable to
that would be
gun
my
rights
hope,
advocates.
but there again, I don't know if that's going to happen.
Senator Simonson, what about on the Senate side? Has there been any meaningful discussion, as far as you know, on gun control?
So there's been a number of bills introduced. Senate Republicans to date have refused to even have a hearing, which has been frustrating for all of these groups that continue to advocate for all of us that want to just prompt a public discussion. We don't really see what the harm in that is, but they just have refused to even give it a hearing. So I don't have high hopes for the passage of any amendments, although I'm sure that there will be some when one of those bills gets to the floor that's got some germaneness to it. But it appears like they are dug in and not willing to even entertain a thought of change.
Representative Sundin?
I just heard an updated statistic on gun deaths in Minnesota. I understood it was a nationwide statistic. About 30% of the gun deaths were attributable to suicide, but I was informed this past week that it's closer to 80% in Minnesota, the gun deaths through suicide. So I think mental health issues enter into this in the greatest way, and if you don't address mental health, possibly more counseling in schools, high schools, if you don't address those, this problem will continue.
Representative Ecklund, was there anything you'd like to share as far as from your perspective on the gun control issue?
Well, I had the same conversation that Representative Sundin did with the NRA lobbyists, and I told him, I said, I think you guys need to get engaged and work on these, on some common sense solutions. I said, because nationally, the two groups that have made the changes, when any social change, has been when students and mothers get involved. And if you look across the country, what's going on, it's students and mothers that are leading the charge on this, and they know how to get organized. I think it's proven, and even a common sense bill like banning bump stocks. I mean, that should have happened. That should have gone through and passed this year. And there was half a dozen bills introduced, I know, in the House by different groups on banning the bump stocks, and even that didn't pass. And it's just when an automatic weapon is illegal, and then there's something that you can buy that can attach to it, that should be illegal also, and that didn't even get a hearing. So
All right, well, thank you. You are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. This is your opportunity to call in with questions to the lawmakers who represent you. Representative Ecklund, as Assistant Minority Leader, you seen any movement on a potential bonding bill this session? What do you think? We haven't heard a lot about bonding so far, and I know there's a lot of folks that are hoping for a bonding bill to pass this session.
Well, I sit on the Capital Investment Committee, and I know the chairman is working very hard to put a bill together. I think we will see a bonding bill, but we have not really heard a number yet. They keep saying somewhere south of $1 billion, which was about where it was last year, 982 million or something like that last year. What's frustrating about that is that seems to me to be an artificial ceiling. Our state bonding capacity is 3.2 billion, and the first $1 billion bonding bill, I believe, was under Governor Arne Carlson, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Representative Murphy?
I believe that's true.
And so it's been a long time that we've been at this artificial ceiling. So not that I'm advocating for breaking it big or anything like that, but you know, you call them a jobs bill, and these construction workers that work on these bonding projects, you know, they might work 3 weeks here and 7 weeks here and 3 months there, but that's how they make their living, and that's how they support their families. So I mean, the bonding projects are a jobs bill for Minnesota. So I'd certainly like to see one.
We'll go right down the line. Are there any bonding projects in your district that you'll be advocating for if the bill comes forward?
Well, I think I probably have more in my district than anybody in the state, but I've got 8 or 10 bonding bills introduced, from the harbor in Grand Marais to sewer project in Silver Creek to a trailhead project in Ely, and a few others in between. So.
And Representative Sundin?
I've got a few, and they're far more important than Representative Ecklund's, but one in particular is Combined Heat and Energy WLSSD project. It's not a big deal, but it is a big deal for ratepayers. Down the line, if they can generate their own energy, which is a hefty price tag for that organization, it's going to reflect in ratepayers down the line. So I'm anxious to get that one across the line.
And Senator Simonson, of course, the city of Duluth is hoping to get the final piece of the puzzle for the steam plant conversion, and I know there are others.
I've heard
as well.
that.
You've heard that before, yeah.
Rumor is, right. You know, actually, we have a number of good projects in the pipeline this year. Not an amount that we can't necessarily get across the finish line, but we have a lot of good projects that are not as large as our ask was a year ago. And that's one of them that we'd like to see finished. But I think that there's room to accomplish all of our projects in northeastern Minnesota without any question.
And Representative Murphy, any in particular you'd like to mention?
Well, my important projects are...
Which are much more important than Representative Sundin's?
I think there are many major things that are consistent in the bonding bill, and the biggest one is HEAPR. And not only for the university system and state colleges, but for the state agencies, and for just keeping up to date on all the things that need to be done with state-owned buildings throughout the state.
Can you explain what HEAPR is?
Well, it's the, I don't know.
It's a long acronym?
It's the roofs, it's the furnaces, it's the changing over if you get a new building and you're leaving the old your building is still going to be used for some other purpose, repurposing kind of things.
So it's infrastructure maintenance.
All the infrastructure that goes from year to year to year, just like a household has. Sure. Parking lots and updating to modern electricity and electronics so that a technology can work. But we also have, the county has a couple asks, an ask for NERC, Northeastern Minnesota Regional Correction Facility, which is 5 counties, Lake and Cook and Couching and Carlton and
St. Louis.
St. Louis, yes. And they also have a request for the depot. And Two Harbors has a couple different things. They need updating on their waste system and water system. and the lift stations. And so there are basic emergency kind of things that need to be done. And that's what the bonding bill is for. And this is supposed to be the every other bonding year. This is the year for bonding. And so it seems to me, although they're talking $800 million for the bonding bill, I think the governor was asking for $1.5 billion. And so maybe we'll get to $1 billion.
Compromise in the middle, maybe.
Maybe.
All right, and Representative Ecklund.
Well, and like Representative Murphy said about the higher ed needs, we've got needs all across the state. DNR, we've got state employees that are working in moldy buildings that's just uncalled for. And so, you know, we like to build things at the legislature. We don't always like to fix things. And so a big part of the bonding bill is asking for asset preservation to fix things, and it needs to be taken care of. The DNR station up in International Falls is 3 trailer houses that are cobbled together. I mean, it's really ridiculous that the people that do the fine work that they do, and they have to work in conditions like that. So.
All right, well, we'll wait and see what happens if a bonding bill does pass. Representative Sundin, did you have something to add? Okay, we got a call from Joe in Mountain Iron. He was listening to the conversation we just had a moment ago about gun control, and his question is, why are people so worried about guns instead of focusing on solving issues with the people operating the guns? You addressed that a little bit, but maybe one of you would like to speak a little bit more about that idea that Joe is pushing. So maybe there's something on both ways to go, Representative Ecklund?
Well, I think we've, that's a great question. I think we've neglected a lot of our mental health services that we've had over the years. You know, I was a county commissioner prior to doing this job, and our jails are full. And our jails are full because we don't have mental health facilities that can help address the issues that are going on in today's society. And there's some programs out there to start building some regional mental health centers, and that's again part of the bonding bill. But this whole issue is just multifaceted. But addressing mental health and taking care of people that are having issues is one of the first places I think we have to start.
Representative Sundin?
Outside of the mental health issue, you'll have the opioid crisis that we're experiencing nationwide. And if you talk to any of your law enforcement people, any of your emergency room doctors, they will tell you that almost all of these problems are stem from drug use or the drug trade, the crime, the violence, and the emergency needs in hospitals. It all comes down to drug use, and it's a problem. And if you don't address that as well, we're going to be looking at this issue 10 years from now in the same light.
And Senator Simonson?
You know, I think it is a great question. It is one that we should really have a spirited public debate about, and that's what the purpose of the committee hearings are for, right? But I think it's also tied back into this, and that if you look at where we were 20 or 30 years ago in terms of what we provided in our educational systems, one of the biggest needs right now that we have not funded over the years is school counselors. And frankly, the need has far outpaced the ability for the counselors to provide those services. But frankly, that's one small piece of the puzzle, right? There's no one thing that the legislature is going to do to prevent these types of tragedies from happening. We could pass universal background checks tomorrow, and it doesn't mean it's going to stop. It's going to take a number of efforts, some small, some larger, to come together, and that's just one piece of it.
And
Representative Murphy?
there's so much else that enters in. Joe is absolutely right. To address this, we need to address what jobs are needed for addressing the problems, the drug problem, the social worker problem. There's a lack of direction for encouraging people to go into the areas where there is a great need for the workers in those new fields that are opening up, or the new crises that have to be addressed. And we're not pushing any kind of incentives for people to want to be social workers or teachers or work in rural Minnesota kind of things. And we have to address the whole community and how it is affected by any type of crisis or incident that could happen, and how they're going to address it. Nothing stands alone. And there's a lot of job needs, and especially in rural Minnesota, when there are issues that affect all of us.
Representative Ecklund, Representative Sundin brought up the opioids issue, and that's something that Governor Dayton and other lawmakers have gotten a lot of interest in this session because it is such a big question. Can you address a little bit what potentially the legislature might do on the opioid abuse issue?
Well, there was a penny a pill bill that was put in at one point in time, and that got shot down. Unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry got their hands on people, and that got shot down, and that would have created a fund to help with the treatment. I think it's a terrific idea because I'll use an example. When I got injured in the mill 25 years ago, the prescription they gave me, the doctor told me right out, be careful with these, because if you take them all before you're done, you're probably going to be hooked. Well, I didn't. I took one of them, and it goofed me up so bad that I didn't take it anymore. But I could see how people would get hooked on it. And we have a colleague in the House, Representative Baker, that lost his son. He didn't lose his son because he went out looking for opioids. He got on opioids because of a car accident or something. I'm not sure even the background of it. And then he had to find it somewhere else. And so we need to do something to rein in what's going on in the industry and in as far as in our medical profession, that whether it's smaller amounts or smaller doses. And I'm not a doctor, so I don't know that part of it, but I just know how easy it is for people to get hooked on that stuff from the pharmaceutical standpoint, and then they don't know what to do once their prescription runs out. So.
And Representative Sundin.
About a month ago, I had a conversation with one of the upper echelon in one of the major hospitals here in town, and he related to me the fact that he can click on one button on his computer, and there's a list of all of his physicians and how many opioids they prescribe. So I think on the professional end, locally, I can see where there's been some movement there to keep an eye on it. And he didn't say there were any problems, of course, but they monitor that. So I think the illegal use of the opioids, maybe they're stolen from a household or bought on the street, one form or another. But I think the professionals locally are doing a pretty good job of what they can do. So.
And Senator Simonson, what about on the Senate side? Have there been any bills moving on opioid legislation?
So the bill that Representative Ecklund just referenced, that bill is still has the funding mechanism in it, and it's still alive in the Senate. I believe it's sitting in the Finance Committee right now. And Senator Rosen, who is the chair of the Finance Committee, is a big proponent of this bill and that funding mechanism. So I'm hopeful that it actually gets across the Senate floor, and that we can get it into conference and get some actual funding put towards this issue without having to take it away from the general fund. I mean, I think everybody that you talk to, at least on the legislative side, will agree, perhaps privately, that it does make some sense.
And Representative Ecklund.
And I just want to say that's a good sign, because that's where something could happen in the conference committee. If that's still in there, even though it isn't in the House side, we could maybe make sure it's safe. Yeah.
Representative Murphy, and this can go to any of the legislators, but I'll start with you. Jim from Hibbing says, I read that legislators gave themselves a $14,000 raise. Why was there not a referendum on this?
Oh, there was a referendum on it, and in fact, it was on the ballot, and 80% of the people in Minnesota, or 79%, 79+% of the people in Minnesota that voted that there should be a commission established to set the pay of the House and Senate. And it passed. The governor appointed the commission. The commission met, I think, 7 times, and the commission voted that the pay should be increased, and they decided that it should be increased to $45,000 for the House of Representatives, and that's what it became. And we, it took place, I think the first check we got was that increased it. Since 1999 was in August of 2017, we received the first pay raise.
Okay. I have some other folks that want to chime in. Representative Ecklund?
Well, so, and that's kind of funny, Mary did a great job on that, but I happen to know one of the people that was on that commission, and they picked somebody from each party, a Republican and a Democrat from each district, so there were 16 of them that were on that commission, and the person who was chosen in International Falls is a very good friend of mine. Everybody here knows him. And he called me up shortly before they met, and he says, for the next 3 months, we can't talk. And I said, really? No, we can't talk. This is it. I'm just telling you right now, we can't talk for the next 3 months. So I assume that the other people that were on that commission that were in the same situation did the same thing. It was kind of funny. I was home for some kind of celebration. I went to a pancake feed, and there he was sitting at that pancake feed. And I went and sit down with him. He said, "You have to sit somewhere else." So I couldn't even sit down and have breakfast with him. But so they took their job very seriously. That's what I'm getting at. And I think they listened to the voters of the state, and this is what happened. So.
Now, you might not be able to answer this question right off the top of your head, Representative Ecklund, but although the legislature is only in session for several months a year, maybe give viewers an idea of how many other meetings, things that you're participating in outside of the legislative session, to give people an idea of the amount of time it takes to do your job.
Well, I sit on the LCCMR committee, and I sit on capital investment. So last summer, I was down in St. Paul at least 2 weeks out of every month for meetings. And some of them, the capital investment wasn't in St. Paul. We'd go to St. Paul, and then we get on a bus and drive all over the state. And then I also sit on the aggregate task force, which met once a month. And so, you know, if I was in St. Paul for 2 weeks out of every month for meetings. And
Does that apply, do you think, Representative Sundin, for most legislators, or is that more because Representative Eklund's assistant minority leader?
I sat on the same task force with Representative Eklund, and then what you do during the week and on weekends, it can vary quite a little bit. But just prior to the show, I had 3 constituents. We were to meet at a restaurant, and the restaurant was closed today, so we sat on my deck for about an hour and a half and visited about issues. So it's it's time-consuming, weekends, nights, in session or out of session.
And Senator Simonson, did the Senate also get a raise, or was that a whole separate issue in the Senate?
No, senators and representatives make the same amount of money, and it was included in this same constitutional amendment. But to the point about, you know, other things that are happening outside the actual legislative session, I think just about every legislator sits on some commission or board or something. So you're seeming, yes, it's nice at the end of May when we're done with the legislative session, but then you got to turn around and usually come right back to St. Paul at least 2 or 3 times a month.
All right.
But I think you have to also include the work that the representatives and senators do with their constituents, and it depends, you know, Representative Ecklund has a much larger
Big
district than I do, but I have a much larger district than Representative Sundin does.
And you're talking about area-wise.
Area-wise,
Population is the same, but-
geographic-wise.
Right, geographically.
And you have to represent the people, all the people in your district, whether it's a small area or a big area. And so I think that average 40-hour weeks are really nice to have in the off-season. That's when we're not in St. Paul in session. But when we're in session and we're still doing our work, there's at least 60-hour weeks, including the weekends when we get home and so forth. But some days when we're in St. Paul, you know, are 15-hour days. And we have rules now that you don't go beyond midnight and that kind of thing, but you can move to suspend the rules at 11 o'clock.
We've got just a
It's
few
not
minutes
smart,
left.
though.
Just a few minutes left in the show. We had a call from John in Renshaw, and I don't think we have anybody that sits on a health committee here, but maybe I'll start with Representative Ecklund. John is wondering, will the legislature pass a bill allowing people to buy into MinCare? Is that something that's out there, Representative Ecklund?
That's one of the governor's proposals, and I don't know where it's at right now. It makes sense to me. This comes back, going back to my county board days. We only have one provider that provides for people up in Koochiching County, and several of the other counties are that way too. So if we could open that up so at least they'd have two options, that would be a good idea. And I think that's getting some traction from the majority party too, because they're about competition too, so they want to see that people have more options. So we might see that come out of this session yet. So.
Okay. Senator Simonson, the Senate Energy and Utilities Finance Bill was approved this week. You sit on that committee. Can you tell us maybe cliff notes of what was in that bill? Anything that folks would be interested in?
You know, it wasn't a huge bill. It was, I think there was just a couple of pieces in there that were somewhat controversial, and it had to do with the renewable development account, which is all tied back into Xcel Energy and more in their service territory. But we had a good debate about the bill. I ended up supporting the bill, but I also I told the chair that one of the things that I wanted to do between then and when this bill actually makes it to the floor is go back and visit with Xcel Energy and some of the tribes about this renewable development account. And it ties back to an agreement that was made many years ago, but generally it was non-controversial and pretty slim bill.
Okay. There's a bill called Tobacco 21 that would prohibit the sale of tobacco to anyone under the age of 21. Just wondering where you might stand on that. Representative Sundin, I'll start with you. What do you think of that bill?
I have no problem with that. I think social smoking is on its way out the door, and if we escort it a little faster, that'd be all right.
Representative Ecklund?
I also don't have a problem with that. I think it's a good idea. The people, when they came and talked to me in my office, I said the one caution I have is you can serve in the military at 18, and so how would that affect our troops and that sort of thing? And being a vet, that kind of thing is always in the back of my mind. But on the other hand, smoking causes a lot of health issues in society and all that stuff. So the sooner we're done with it, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
And Representative Murphy, do you know, is that bill moving? Where that might be at this stage of the process?
I don't know where that is. It was lobbied about a month ago, and I think it's still sitting in Health and Human Services, but I'm not sure on that.
When Representative Schultz comes back, we'll have a lot of questions for him. Have a question here about Representative Murphy, former state lawmaker, tax judge Earl Gustafson of Duluth, died recently. Do you have any memories, stories you might want to share about Representative Gustafson?
Well, I shared them with my colleagues on the floor of the House of Representatives the other day, and took more time than perhaps many were thinking, what does a 90-year-old man stand for? But to me, he stands for principles and humor and community action and just being a good person all his life and doing what the people of Minnesota needed at the right time. He was an outstanding elected official, but he was an outstanding father and a husband and a community person that many people strive to follow. As a tax court judge, I said this on the House floor, as a tax court judge, there couldn't be anyone better, because that tax court goes out to the people, and the people don't have to have an attorney come to them with their tax problem. They just have to write request a hearing, and under the rules of what the tax court deals with. And the tax court, most of the time, goes out to the people. And they come in and they state their story, and then the three judges that meet with the constituent decides whether they're right or wrong. And So it's a conversation and it's a solution and a settlement all at the same time. And he did that so very well. And the people of Minnesota, although he's been retired for years, I'm sure were well served by the teams of tax court judges that he served with. And the people of Duluth, that was back when we had 6 representatives from Duluth, 59th, 60th, and 61st. And he was the representative for the 60th, and then he became a senator for the 60th. And so, and then the job must have been so well that it worked so well within their family that when Ben Gustafson was a young man, his son, he became a state representative. And so the family knew what service was all about. And he was a good person, and we are going to miss him, and we are going to try to follow his example.
Representative Sundin, we just have less than a minute left now.
Okay, we lost another legislator last week, and under better circumstances. Former Speaker of the House, Paul Thiessen, resigned, and he'll be headed for the Supreme Court of the state of Minnesota. Just it was always a proud moment when he spoke up on the floor for the party and for the public. He's a good public servant. He'll be missed.
All right, and with that, we're going to have to wrap it up. Want to mention tomorrow's Workers' Memorial Day. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, Representative Ecklund, Representative Sundin, Senator Simonson, Representative Murphy, thank you very much. We are out of time this week on Minnesota Legislative Report. Again, I'd like to thank all the lawmakers who make this program possible each and every week. And thanks to everyone who called with their questions. Please join us again next Sunday for another live edition of Legislative Report. For the crew here at WDSC TV, I'm Greg Grell. Have a great evening.